So today's poll question is tea, sweet tea or unsweet tea. And I was shocked earlier when Jason asked that here in the room anyway, like it's about half and half, like half are sweet, half are unsweet. Maybe some of you in the room are like me. Please, somebody watching online, be like me. I'm neither sweet, Amy's like amen, or unsweet. I'm half and half. Anybody else half and half, right? Like half sweet, half unsweet, right? As a preacher, I remember the days where we used to preach messages about not being half and half, right? Like Michael Christian, you remember preaching this to students, right? Like neither be not lukewarm, but be hot or cold, right? Nathan Teeters, where are you? You remember this, right? Like, you can't be in the middle. You got to choose a side. You got to be on this side or this side. Jesus said, don't be lukewarm, right? Listen, they listened. The world's listened. We're not half and half anymore. It's either this corner or this corner. Yes or no, right? That's how it doesn't matter. If it's a political issue, we're either in this corner or we're in this corner. If it's a social justice issue, or rather a social injustice issue, we're in this corner or we're in this corner. If it's a pandemic issue, we're in this corner or we're in this corner. If it's unforeseen kiss or sloppy wet kiss. We're in this corner or we're in this corner, right? That's how our world is today. We're so divided and so polarized. The question I have for you today as we wrap up this message series is this. No matter what corner you're in, no matter what topic we're talking about, are you called to love the person in the opposite corner? And if so, how do I love the person in the opposite corner? We've been looking at Jesus' way. This way of taking off the boxing gloves and getting out of the ring and pulling up a chair. And we've been in John chapter 4. So if you got a Bible this morning, I want to invite you to go ahead and turn to John chapter 4. And then, if it's your phone, that's great too. And then I also want you to go over to John chapter 13 and put a marker there or be ready to get there on your phone because we're going to end up in John chapter 13. But we've been looking at this story in John chapter 4 of Jesus meeting this Samaritan woman at a water well. And Samaritans and Jews, which Jesus was a Jew, were in opposite corners in the day over lots of different things. How they looked at the Bible, the Old Testament, how they worshiped, where they worshiped. And then we've got, in this story, we've also got that Jesus was a male and she was a female, and in culture, males didn't speak to females, especially Jewish rabbis didn't speak to Samaritan women at this time. And so there was all of these things that kept them in opposite corners. But Jesus meets with this woman, and he's just, first of all, kind to her. Is that something we've lost in our culture today? Just the ability to be kind to someone who's in a corner that's opposite of us. And Jesus was kind just because he spoke to her. He didn't have to. And he carried on this conversation with her, and he was present with her. These are all the things that we've talked about in this sermon series. Like, he was just present with her. And how was he present? He looked her in the eye, and he listened to her. Not trying to formulate his next comeback or his response. He just gave her time to speak. And he felt such empathy for her and compassion for her. He extended her grace. Like, he saw her as the person that she was created to be. He didn't even necessarily see her as who she was. He saw her as who she could be. Amy and I have been talking about this a lot lately. We've got a 22-year-old and an 18-year-old, and I could tell you stories about parenting that would shock you, number one, because you would be like, Amy's kids did that? Yes, Amy's kids did that. And number two, it would shock you because you would be like, oh my gosh, you too? Like, I can resonate with that, right? And we're just now getting to the point where we can begin to share some of these stories and talk about some of these stories. But one of the things as a parent, parenting teenagers especially, I've come to learn and know is that, like, I have to see in my kids who God created them to be and who they can be. Not the numb knuckle that they just did, whatever the episode or the incident was, right? And that's who Jesus saw. That's grace. That's who Jesus saw, or what he saw in this woman. But he also extended her bold truth. Like, go read John chapter 4 this week, and you will see the truth that Jesus gave to her, spoke to her very plainly. And listen, I want to share the rest of the story with you because we haven't gotten there in this message series. But the rest of the story is this. The woman took that truth, she went back into the village, she left the well, she went back into the village, and she told the people in the village, you got to come meet a man that knew everything I had ever done. Like, the truth resonated with her, and that's where she went back and began to share. She didn't share, hey, I met this Jewish guy, or hey, this guy spoke to me, or hey, we didn't even get water, and he said this weird thing about living. What? She went back and she repeated the truth that Jesus spoke to her. And because of that, not only did she enter into a relationship with Jesus, the scripture tells us that many in her village did as well. The really cool thing about that is what we find is that they wanted to come meet this Jesus themselves. Maybe, just maybe, I hope I've been preaching on it for 4 weeks. If we would drop the boxing gloves, get out of the boxing ring, pull up a chair with people who look different than us, think differently than us, act differently than us, and be kind to them, look them in the eye, listen to them, give them all the grace that Jesus would give them, and share truth as we know it. Just maybe the world would want to know a little bit more about this Jesus guy. This morning, I want to wrap up with maybe one of the most important things that we find in this story, that we find in the Jesus way of moving out of the boxing ring and over to the table to pull up a chair. And I'm going to go back and share verse 9 with you out of John chapter 4. I know I've shared it 3 Sundays, probably. I think at least 2 in this message series. But in John chapter 4, verse 9, this is when Jesus first meets the woman at the well. The Samaritan woman said to him, how is it that you, a Jew, ask for a drink from me, a woman of Samaria? And in the English Standard Version, in parentheses, we get this. For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. Now, what did she just do with that statement? She's telling Jesus, for Jews, Jesus was a Jew, have no dealings with Samaritans. She was a Samaritan. What did she just do? She just put Jesus in a corner. You see that? For you, your people, those people have nothing to do with me, my people, us. You see, you're over there. You're on that side. You're in that corner. And she put it on the Jews. Do you see that? Look, she didn't say, because everybody knows Jews and Samaritans don't get along. She didn't say, listen, because of the complicated history between the Samaritans and the Jews, we don't get along. No, do you see what she said? You Jews, you look different, you think different, you act different. Do you see it? And here's what else she did in saying that. She put the onus to change on Jesus. Do you see it? You Jews, you. Here's what she did. Listen close. She gave Jesus power. Now listen, here's what I mean by that. You see, when someone looks, thinks, acts differently than us, and they sit in a different corner or stand in a different corner, who has power? The opposite corner. Here's why. Because what we're saying is this. Listen. If you would think differently. If you would act differently, here's what we're really saying. If you would think the way I do, and if you would act the way I do, then we wouldn't have this divide. Then we wouldn't have this polarization. See? But we put it all on the other corner. The power's all in your corner. The ball's on your side of the court. If you would just think differently and act differently, then boom, we could get along happily ever after. And what's the other side doing to us? They're giving us power, aren't they? They're saying to us, if you would just think like me, if you would just act like me, if you would just do this, if you would just take this step, if you would just do this action, if you would just say this, if you would just think this way. You see, they're giving us power. So here's the real question this morning. If the real question is not, am I supposed to love, or how do I love? The real question is, what do I do when I realize that I have this power? What do I do when I'm ascribed this incredible power by someone else? You follow me? Okay, let's go to John chapter 13. In John chapter 13, Jesus is in what we know now as the upper room. He's celebrating what we call the Last Supper with his disciples. So Jesus, the next day, will be crucified. He will be placed in a tomb. But this last evening, he celebrated what was the Passover meal. Now, this is something that Israelites, that Jewish people did every year. They did it religiously. God set it up for them and said, I want you to do this every single year. It just happened to fall on this time when Jesus was crucified. By the way, Jesus was the Passover lamb. And so he's celebrating this Passover meal with the disciples, right? And so, and they were going through all the tradition. Like there was this tradition of eating bitter herbs because it reminded them of the bitterness when they were in slavery in Egypt. And then they ate this unleavened bread because it reminded them of how they didn't have time to put yeast in the bread before they were called out of Egypt to be led through the Red Sea and into the wilderness, the promised land, right? And so they had unleavened bread, and so they celebrated with that. There were 4 cups of redemption that they celebrated in the Passover meal, and each one of them had special significance, and it reminded them of that time that they were slaves. It reminded them of the plagues that God had put on the Egyptian people, on Pharaoh, right? Like the plague of the pandemic of boils, or the natural disaster of 2 hurricanes in the Gulf at the same. I think it was hailstones. It was something like that. There was all these things, and they were to remember. The last one was they were to remember that if they took the blood of the lamb, smeared it across their doorpost, the angel of death would sacrifice, would pass over their firstborn, and they would be led out of Egypt into the promised land. And Jesus was going through this, but as he was going through it, he changed the order and he began to institute what we call his Holy Communion, Eucharist, the Lord's Supper, because he changed the wording. This is my body and this is my blood. And even before he did that, he did something totally unorthodox. Like the people are coming into the room, the disciples are coming into the room, and it was tradition back then that there was someone, it was usually the lowest servant in the household, would take a basin of water and would take a towel and would wash whoever's feet was coming into the room, the guests that were entering into their home. Why? Because they wore sandals and they traveled on dusty roads and their feet got dirty. And so it was just custom, it was tradition. When someone came into their home, they would wash their feet. There wasn't a servant in the upper room. And what I mean by that is, none of the disciples thought they were the servant. In fact, if you go back and read John chapter 13, they were actually arguing about who was the greatest. So Jesus took off his outer garment, wrapped a towel around his waist, knelt down in front of every disciple's feet, and washed their feet. Now, you tell me, whose feet did he wash? Well, the 12 disciples. All right, well, who were the 12 disciples? Well, He washed the feet of Matthew. When Jesus called Matthew, Matthew was a tax collector. Tax collectors were cheaters. They cheated people out of money. They took more than the Roman government required and they put it in their own pockets. He was a dishonest guy before he began to follow Jesus. There was Thomas. Thomas would later get the nickname Doubter because he doubted everything. There was James and John, and Jesus gave James and John the nickname Sons of Thunder. They were brothers, Sons of Thunder. Now, I want to know, what do you do for Jesus to give you the nickname Son of Thunder, right? And then there was James the Less. How would you like to be known as the Less, right? Then there was Peter, the disciple, right? We all love Peter. There was Simon. Simon was a zealot, a political zealot. Really, Simon was a political extremist. And then this one always blows me away. There was Judas, who moments after Jesus washed his feet would leave that room and sell Jesus out for money, would betray him. Yet Jesus washed every one of their feet. In John chapter 13, verse 1, you don't have this. I don't think it's going to be on the screen or on your TV screen. John chapter 13, verse 1. This is now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own. Remember, our question is, do we love and how? Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. Some of your translations will say, he showed them the full extent of his love. Now, the word love there is really important. See, because in the Greek language, there are at least 7 words, if not more, for the word in English, love. Right? In our English language, we have one word, love. Right? It means everything. I love boxing, I love eating. Right? It's the same. It's the same for everything. In the Greek, there were more than one word. There was this word in the Greek for love that meant familial love, like family love, like I love my family. Like you understand that, being part of a dysfunctional family, you know how love your family works, right? There was this word for brotherly love, like best friends would share or good friends would share. There was this word for romantic love. Actually, the word was erotic, but it was this word for romance or romantic love. And then there's this word agape. And that's what we see in John chapter 13, verse 1. That Jesus showed the disciples agape love. By the way, it's also the same word used for love when Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5, love your enemies. Those that are in the opposite corner from you, those that don't look like you, think like you, act like you, love those enemies. By the way, it was the same word Jesus used when asked what's the greatest commandment. He said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. It was also the same word that Jesus used when he said, and there's another commandment that's as equal to the first one, love your neighbor as yourself. In fact, the word love, agape, is used overwhelmingly by Jesus as opposed to family love, brotherly love, erotic love. And the word agape is not what we think of most of the time in our English use of the word love in terms of this feeling. Right? Like, if I ask the question, do we love those in the opposite corner from us, then most of us just generally go to, I have to like them? I have to feel all this mushy, gushy stuff inside of me towards them? I have to express any kind of positive emotion towards them? The word agape is completely different. Here's what agape means. In John chapter 13, who was the most powerful person in the room? Listen, if you're in church and you don't know the answer, just say Jesus. Nobody's going to get on to you for that, right? Jesus was the most powerful person in the room. And what did he do with that power? He showed agape love, and here's what that means. He leveraged his power for the benefit of everyone else in the room, including the one who would betray him. When we look at how polarized and divided our world is, and we look at those in the corner that are opposite of us, and they look back at us, we give them power because we want them to do something, to think differently, to act differently. They give us power back because they want us to think differently and act differently. And what do we do when we realize that we have the power? We leverage it for the benefit of another person, of someone else. That's the kind of love that Jesus asks us to give to those who look, think, and act differently than us, is to want the very best for them. To leverage the influence that God has given us on their behalf. To take our status and our significance, whatever that means in our culture, and use it for their good, on their behalf. Jesus said this at the end of his time, there in the upper room, starting in verse 12. It says, when he had washed their feet and put on his outer garments and resumed his place, he said to them, do you understand what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you also should do just as I have done to you. As I wrap up this series this morning, the challenge to us is this: to take those who look differently than you do, think differently than you, act differently than you do, wash their feet. Leverage your power for their good. Want the very best for them. Love them. Agape, love them. Because that's what Jesus did for you and for me. I hope you have a communion cup in your hand if you're in the room. If you don't, if you would raise your hand, we'll have somebody bring a communion cup to you. If you're at home, now is the time to go and find whatever it is that you have, cracker, water, goldfish, wine, whatever you have at your house that you want to use to participate in communion. If you're in the room, I would ask that you take your communion cup and just put it in your hand. And take the very top, so there's 2 layers. We call this COVID communion, okay? There's 2 layers to COVID communion. You take the very top plastic layer and peel it away, and you'll find a wafer, a cracker there in the very top. At home, use your cracker, your goldfish, whatever you have, and I want you to take, and I just want you to put it in your hand right now. And the words Jesus used that night in the upper room with all of those disciples, including the one that would betray him, is, this is my body, which is broken for you. Let me ask you a question. Have you always been in the same corner as Jesus? Not that Jesus is in a corner, but go with me for a little bit this morning. Have you always done everything Jesus has asked you to do? Have you always believed exactly like Jesus wants you to believe? Have you always behaved exactly the way Jesus wants you to behave? I'm guessing the answer to that is no. But you know what? Jesus washes your feet. He gave his body because he wants the very best for you. He leveraged his influence, his power for you by giving his body. And so this morning, I'm going to ask that you take and eat this cracker or whatever you have at home. And as you do, I want you to just silently pray, thanking God for his body that He loves you this much. So take and eat. If you have a cup like I do, then you're going to take the next layer and you're going to peel it back. If you're at home and you have juice or water or whatever it is, and then you can take and be ready to drink. As you look at the juice, or whatever it is you have, be reminded this morning that Jesus gave His blood for you, and as He hung on the cross, it dripped down from His body. And it dripped to the ground at the foot of the cross, and at the foot of the cross were those who loved Jesus, and there were those who were responsible for putting Jesus on the cross. I'd say that was definitely opposite corners. And Jesus' blood was for everyone at the foot of the cross, and for all of us today. So as you take and drink, remember, Jesus loves, agape loves every single person. And take and drink. Now that I have given my body, Jesus says, now that I have given my blood, Jesus says, now that I have washed your feet, Jesus says, go and wash others' feet. Not just those who look, think, and act the way you do. Go and wash others'